Jeff, we should shut the door.
I'll shut it.
Thank you. And also, I think you should open this week because I always hop in first, and it is Worship Guy, Tech Guy, not Tech Guy opens, followed by Worship Guy. What a terrible beginning to a podcast.
We're glad you're here. This is season 2, episode 3.
Wait, we're keeping that?
Yeah, we're going to keep it.
Unbelievable. We didn't shut the studio door, and I complained about how much I talk.
This is real life, folks. This is season 2, episode 3 of Worship Guy, Tech Guy. My name is Jeff.
Here we go. Are you sure?
We were doing so well. We were going to go for...
Just say your name's Jeff.
My name is Jeff.
My name's Gabe.
I'm a worship guy.
I'm a tech guy.
And Gabe and I hang out and talk shop while you listen, whether you're driving, taking your kids to school, in your kitchen making chocolate cupcakes, which Gabe has shared a killer chocolate cupcake recipe with me, and we should make that into a segment at one point.
Oh, my goodness. And we'd like to thank both of you for listening. We appreciate
All 2 of you.
It's made us feel so much better. Jeff, today we're talking about another important aspect of streaming. Last week we talked about audio. This week we're talking about lights and cameras because they kind of go together, and I couldn't figure out a way to do the one without the other or do the other without the one. So we're going to put them together into something that's hopefully potent and potable and useful for your stream. Basic concept, you have cameras, you're using it to record what's going on the stage. You also have lights, you're using the lights to light the people on the stage. And so we're going to help you, hopefully, do both of those better.
We are in a series of streaming kind of how-tos, basics. It's funny we didn't start with cameras, but I think it was good to go out of order because people often overlook audio. And in this episode, we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of streaming cameras and lights.
So let's just dive right into the exciting world of luminaires. The first thing we'll just say with lighting is the stage probably for broadcast purposes needs to be brighter than you think. In my former life as a traveling musician and technical person, eventually on tours, we did a couple of things where we worked with DVD production teams, and I was the lighting director on a couple of those. One in particular, I just remember clear as day, like the shows looked great, and then the camera crew comes in, they're like, we're going to need it way brighter than this. Way bright. Now, granted, this is probably 7-8 years ago, shooting with DSLRs. The mirrorless cameras have kind of changed the game pretty substantially, but the principle still applies, which is tip number 1, the stage probably needs to be brighter for your stream than it currently is if you're not happy with your current product.
Yes, and as we talked about in this series, your streaming church is a campus. Your stream is not just an add-on of your church experience. It is a campus that you need to treat it as such. So I was just having this conversation today with our production directors. So at my church, we go pretty production heavy, and we do a lot of moments in the set where the front wash will fade out. And it looks really great in the room, and you probably don't lose the connection in the room. But what we're trying for on the stream, when it goes black or dim, it looks different. It looks very different on the stream. And so we've just had to, and there was nothing wrong with the way we were doing it before, but now that online is a campus, we have to think, okay, how does our lighting choices affect both worlds?
Boy, that is so true. So we're gonna power through the lighting fairly quickly because, frankly, the camera side is a lot more technical. But they do work together. And so we'll just say off the bat, you want one fixture per leader or per worship leader, or depending on now there are definitely some taste issues here. So I'm not going to pretend like that's not a thing, but you're going to want one fixture or one light per worship leader if you want them to be, lit up. And I would suggest a fixture that has a flat field of light. So something like a Lico or like an ellipsoidal, it's like a stage light, or maybe a Fresnel, where the distance from the cone of the light, like the light that appears on the stage, doesn't have a hot spot.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what does flat field of light mean?
Sure. So like with a Parcan, for example, which used to be the kind of standard back in the days of Queen, these Parcans, it's a parabolic. Basically, it's shooting a super bright area of light across the middle where the coil of electricity is creating the light. And then the edges of the field are significantly darker. So what happens is, as your worship leader, if they're moving around, they're moving in and out of that hot spot. And so because of that, it messes with especially on camera, it messes with the way that looks. So, a Fresnel has a lens on it that helps the field to be more even. A Leica also does that. The one thing that the Leica gives you that a Fresnel might not is a hard edge, which has benefits and non-benefits for in the room. So like the edge of where the light is, there's light there, and then there's absolutely not like a foot away. Does that make sense?
Hey, Gabe.
Yeah.
What's a Fresnel and what's a Leica?
A Fresnel is how do you describe it? It has a lamp inside of it, and then the lens is, it looks almost like a mason jar kind of. The lens is kind of a thicker and piece of glass, and it creates a wash effect where the edges of the light are soft. So that means it bleeds.
So what's a Leica?
Now, Leica also has a lamp inside of it, so like a 2-pin lamp as opposed to like a par lamp bulb kind of thing. And it has what's called like a hood or sometimes I call them a hat. But essentially, this is a lens, and you can change the width of the light as it throws. So like you could put a 26-degree lens on there, or you could put a 50-degree lens, and that'll change the width of the range of the light. And then it also, when you move the lamp or the lens backwards or forwards, it either softens the edge or it hardens the edge. And it also changes the field a little bit.
That is super helpful.
Does that make sense?
Thank you for clearing that up.
Sure. And I'm not saying, by the way, that you can't use, LED wash fixtures or just regular like pan tilt wash fixtures are totally usable too. They're just a little more expensive, not quite as accessible. And I've found LED fixtures they're just more of a challenge to get the color balance right when you're white balancing your cameras, which we'll get to later on.
Cool.
You want to throw in your own lighting tips or just...
Yeah, well, that was the next question I was going to ask is, as far as like the lens technology or the differences in the way that the light kind of gets thrown are the same with conventional lights, which conventional lights are non-LED, meaning they have like a bulb with a filament that gets hot and glows, right? Whereas LEDs is just a different lighting source. Like the Fresnel, you can get a Fresnel that's conventional and a Fresnel that is LED, right? Mm-hmm. The only difference is the light source.
Correct.
But the trade-off with it, the LED light source is going to change the color temperature and look different than a conventional.
Yes.
Yes. So would you recommend, and maybe we'll get into this later, for those lights, conventional or LED? Or just pick your adventure?
Yeah, it kind of has to do with money, honestly.
Yeah, that's a real thing. Budgets are real things.
Yeah, like so a used Leica, you can get one of those for like $250, for a light, and now you're going to need a dimmer pack with it. Yeah. But those are only $150, $200, so you can get into 4 of those lights with a dimmer pack to power them all with lamps for, $1,000, $1,500, whereas one LED Leica is going to run you $1,500, $1,000 to $1,500 just for the single light. Now, your LED Leica is only going to pull like 100 watts max, maybe 50 watts max, whereas your Leica might pull 1,000 watts. And so maybe you don't have the power up in your ceiling to handle that super, that high output. So you know what I mean? So it is kind of there's pros and cons there for sure. We use both. We have LEDs and just conventional, and we find them there to be pros and cons of each. So ultimately, yes, LED, conventional lights, both have pros and cons. Just a couple other quick tips before we move to cameras. You're definitely going to need something to light your upstage. So that means lights that are coming kind of behind the people on stage that are lighting the stage from behind. The reason is because you're going to need that most likely for your camera's depth of field to kind of help with the focus and help with, the image not looking too like there's a floating head and then a complete black background, which is a common problem, especially with cheaper cameras. And then also, I don't want to devalue the use of fill lights, which are especially for like a sermon, which essentially you have like a key light, which is the main light that's right lighting the subject. And then fill lights would be lights coming in at maybe 45 degrees or, just behind them at 45 degrees. And it kind of helps light the backs or sides of their head so that they don't feel like a floating head. It just contributes to that feeling more like you're in a room and less like it makes the image look three-dimensional.
Exactly. It puts them in a space where it becomes less utilitarian, but there's some spatial context there.
Sure. Last thing, if you're experiencing an issue with bags under the eyes, that kind of look, like where you've got your lights hung and you look at the people's face and there's bags under the eyes, most likely it has to do with the lights being too close to your stage. So maybe your lights are 15 feet in the air and they're 5 feet in front of the stage. That's a common thing that I've run into where they're just rigged wrong. So you're kind of looking for 45 degrees in terms of 15 feet away from the stage, 15 feet up. That's kind of a theater thing.
Yeah.
There's a book that is very loosely, you can loosely work with. It's, theory of lights kind of thing from a theater perspective. It'll help you just get a little more success before we get onto the cameras.
Okay, so cameras. You got to have them. You got to have a few of them, ideally, for different shots. Why do you want multiple cameras? For visual interest, all right? How long do you, a single camera works for a security system. You want to see if your Amazon package got to the front door. But when you're watching a 35, 45-minute sermon or an hour-long church service, including that sermon, you want to have some visual interest. And you need to place these cameras at various spots in your room, and you may not have the space for it. There's a few different options for it. You can do PTZ cameras. Do we want to talk about PTZ cameras?
We totally can. I'm flexible. I mean, I would say that our church started with one camera.
Yeah.
And nobody really noticed it to be that big of a deal until technology started to grow. For example, when YouTube first came out, the standard was not what it is now. Now 1080p is kind of the thing on the internet, right? And because of that, multiple cameras are now standard too. I mean, your average podcast, if they're doing video, they have more than one camera.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just something that I feel like as a church, we should, we're not trying to change the message, but we do want to keep up with the way the message is delivered. And so 2 cameras, I would say it's better to have 2 pretty good cameras than 1 unbelievable camera. And PTZs contribute into that.
Yes. PTZ stands for pan, tilt, zoom. They are cameras that are little robotic things, and you can remotely pan them, tilt them, and zoom them in. We had one. It worked pretty good. It looks a little corporate.
Sure.
To just being honest here, there are tons of options for good cameras, and that's probably the question a lot of people have is Gabe, what camera should I get?
I can tell you our journey in a very short, concise way. We started a long time ago with a Canon XA10, and that's kind of the basic, the first prosumer offering that Canon has in the XA line is the XA10. And now they're the whole way up to XA, I think it's 55. And that XA line, Canon, not a sponsor, pretty good for the money. I've put them in a bunch of churches. They look good enough. They don't look poor. They don't look bad, certainly, and they're not super expensive for what the output is. But the question is, what am I looking for? Ultimately, you're looking for a camera that has a big enough sensor that it can provide an image that looks of a quality that you're comfortable with. And so a lot of times the issue with churches is you're shooting from a long distance. So if you're shooting from 60 feet away, if it's 60 feet from where your camera's going to be to the front of the stage, you need a lens on that camera that's going to be, generally the whole camera built out to support that image. And that's kind of the challenge, is finding a camera that will do that. So in our situation, started with an XA10, moved to an XA15, and then when we did a building project, we ended up with a Panasonic AG-200X something or other, really, nicer single camera. But then when the pandemic hit, we needed to switch to multiple cameras. So ultimately, I had some friends that were using the Sony Alphas, and I borrowed a Sony Alpha, I think it was an A7 III, and it blew my mind. Mirrorless cameras look incredible. I would recommend them even for more of a starter kind of environment, because you can find them fairly cheap, especially used, and there's a whole assortment of lenses that you can use to kind of get you close. And low light is not as much of an issue with mirrorless, which we'll get into in a little bit. How about you? What was your kind of...
Yeah, so we had some JVC thing. Not going to try to think of the model number, but it was, people kind of know the journey of cameras is they start out really big and clunky, and then they get more streamlined and small and better. So we had a JVC thing, and then had the opportunity to expand our video capabilities and stream. This was all before the pandemic, but kind of the purpose of the live stream is not the same, or the value of the live stream wasn't as great as it is now in these post-pandemic times. So we were able to upgrade to Blackmagic Studio 4Ks. These are little tiny guys. They almost look like a coffee mug, like they're about that size. And they look fantastic. We were talking before we pressed record on this pod.
Before you forgot to shut the door?
Before I forgot to shut the door.
Oh, goodness.
You know, that you could go into maybe churches and have these giant studio cameras that you'd see on, Channel 5 News, and they look just like that. They look fantastic. So we have 2 of those, and then we have also a Blackmagic Ursa, which that's like an all-in-one workhorse. You can do a lot of things with it, things that I don't really know what it can do, because cameras are kind of I know what they do.
Sure.
I don't get into the guts of it.
You're a worship leader. You're supposed to have your coffee and your flat-brimmed hat. And then where was the microphone? Is it over here? And then you go there and you make the people happy.
That's all I got to do.
Right. Well, and pray.
Pray.
You have to pray.
That's all I do. Only work on Sundays.
Sure thing. Must be nice.
So those are some camera options. What are some of the features you want to pay attention to with some of these cameras?
Here we go, Jeff. I'm going to say a lot of words, and they're going to be technical words, but I'm going to try to make them as concise and reasonable as possible. Ultimately, in video, in photography, for starters, there's something called the big 3. And the big 3 are shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. You with me?
I'm with you, man.
Okay. So in photography, the big 3 are a bigger deal because you don't have the same constraints in photography because you're just taking a moment in time. Whereas in video, you're taking many, many, many moments in time into moving pictures. That's still how it works today. So if you get nothing else out of this entire podcast and you're having problems with your stream, here's what I would recommend for your camera situation. One is understanding the difference between shutter speed and frame rate. Okay. So a lot of times and this even applies when you're looking to buy a camera. So if you're looking to buy a camera and the native output might be 1080p or 4K at 30 FPS, that means it is 1080p resolution at 30 frames per second. That's how many frames, 30 frames in 1 second. Now shutter speed is the amount of time that shutter is opening to capture that frame. Does that make sense?
It does. If I may also add,
Yep.
Shutter speed is applicable, has always been applicable to the photography world.
Yes.
Whereas frame rate was not applicable to
Indeed.
the photography world. It was applicable to the video world.
Sure thing.
So I'm glad you touched on that because they're related and you might not think they're related in video world.
Right.
Tell us how they're related.
Why they matter is because if you get the difference between your shutter speed and frame rate off, you're going to get blurry motion on stage. And the reason for that is because the shutter is open too much. What's a good way to say this? Basically, there's a rule called the 180 rule where if your frame rate is 30, you want your shutter speed to be 60. Because that's the ratio, the magic ratio that allows the amount of time that shutter is open to coincide properly with the amount of frames that are in that second. Does that make sense?
Yes. Does it make sense, too, that the frame rate has to be double what the shutter speed is, or is it the other way around?
It's frame rate is 30, shutter speed 60. Now,
Okay.
It gets more complicated because the kind of the classic look for film is 24 frames per second, right?
Yes. Yep.
In which case you would have a 150 shutter speed. So, 50, whatever. So, and that gives you more, the look is more film. It's kind of like more smooth.
Yeah.
Right. Whereas 30 is more like kind of news broadcast. 60 is like action film, like crazy stuff. Right.
Yep.
So the question is, if you're at 60, why don't you have a shutter speed of 120? Answer: the bigger your shutter speed is, the higher your shutter speed is, the darker the image is. So that means that you need to compensate by opening up your aperture or cranking up your ISO, which can create grain in the image, in the video image. Does that make sense?
It does.
So a lot of times that gain that you get from the for starters, once your shutter's moving that fast, it's not that big of an improvement anyway. You're already getting plenty of motion. You're actually starting to go the other way. It's starting to potentially get robotic. So anyway, ultimately for video, you're really not going to be moving that around all that much. Let me tell you why. If you have any kind of video wall or sometimes even projectors or TVs on stage, 24 just isn't going to work in my experience. You get a line going through your displays, like the refresh rate of the display.
Yeah.
So it's just because the refresh rate of like an LED wall or a TV is 60. So because we live in America where it's 60 hertz, and then if you're running at 50 frames per second on 24 frames per second, the refresh rate ends up being off. So you see that movement, right?
Yes,
it's not moving fast enough.
So rule of thumb,
yeah,
you want to keep it around like the 30 to 60, right?
Yeah, I mean, we shoot in 30 here. Now, there's probably a film nerd out there that's like, well, you can get around it if you use a demoxificator, and they could be right. Just in my life experience, it's just easier to run it at 30. It looks good. It's pretty standard.
And you'll make up that quality with good quality cameras and good quality lenses, which we'll get to in a minute.
Yeah.
And I know with a lot of, like my first kind of walk into video world was with DSLR cameras, and a lot of people were shooting in 24 frames per second because it just looked really, really cool. And it was after that effect. And you might think, well, I want to shoot in 24 because I want that cinematic look. But you'll notice the quality with a good quality camera with a good quality lens at 30, that 30-60 relationship, and you'll forget about the whole 24 infatuation.
Yeah, it's not so, I mean, you can make up for that lack of more fluid motion with just better, lighting effects, general brightness, which we'll get to like right now. The next bit that you're going to need to deal with in the big three is ISO. ISO stands for ISO. And it actually stands, I think it's International Standards Organization is where it came from. And the shortest answer, if you're trying to understand what it used to be the kind of film.
Exactly.
So in film, like when we actually had films for movies, there were different properties of film, and those properties would be the ISO. That would be, it's ISO 640 film or ISO 250 film.
It was how sensitive that film was to light.
Indeed. And we make up for that now with ones and zeros. So that's available in almost all video cameras where you turn up the ISO is 1,000, it's brighter. If it's 200, it's darker.
Let's give a range here. If you were to buy like a middle of the road back in the day when your mom and my mom would go to the store and make sure they had camera film for your 5th birthday party, it would probably be ISO 800, ISO 400.
Something like that, yeah.
So that's kind of like standard. I took a photography class in college, and we always used ISO 800. So give me like a quick, like, where do you want to operate in? Because we've got a vast range of ISO choices in our cameras. Where do we want to live?
Sure.
For streaming?
So I think before we answer that question, cliffhanger, I think we should talk aperture. Because in my experience, I'm not the greatest video person in the world. I'm actually a lighting guy. And I had to learn video. In my experience, you want to do your work with the aperture, not with the ISO.
So we'll circle back.
We'll circle
ISO.
back.
Okay.
And the reason for that is I am fundamentally opposed to solving lighting problems in a camera with a digital solution. So, and I think most people are. So if you're having issues with brightness, you don't want to fix it with gain, because gain is a digital correction, right? It's like digital zoom. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So you're not fixing the optics. You're putting a filter over it to fix something that's broken.
You're kind of doing a trick.
Exactly. You're doing a trick. And I want to fix it at the foundational level. So the aperture, what's happening here, the aperture or the f-stop was the other idea. You might, on the side of lenses, you might see something that says f1.4 or f8. And what that is the size of the hole in the lens. So it's the amount of light that's getting inside the lens. And here's the other pearl of wisdom from this podcast that you can just repeat over and over for the rest of your life. Here it comes. The lower the f-stop number, the larger the opening in the lens.
The lower the f-stop, the larger the opening in the lens.
Bam. The less depth of focusable field, the blurrier the background. So the lower the f-stop, you have an f1.4, gigantic opening in the lens, meaning the depth of field is very small. The area of focusable space is very small, which means you can have that blurry background that you see in all the super artistic shots where you've got it in portrait mode in your iPhone. It's an area of space in which you are in focus.
That's correct.
Right?
It's a small area.
It's a small area, especially if you're shooting from like 50 feet away. Look, and here's why this matters. Let's say you're trying to get your pastor's head to look perfect. Wouldn't it be negative if his nose was perfect, but his eyes were out of focus? That's a shallow depth of field.
So, yes. And in this instance you bring up, a semi-higher f-stop would be appropriate.
Yeah.
So why don't you explain the converse of all that?
Well, ultimately, this is a taste issue. I mean, you know what you want your you know what you want your frame to look like, what you want your sermon, what you want your worship to look like. But at the end of the day, it's got to be practical. I mean, you've got some people have backgrounds that they wouldn't mind if they're a little blurry, frankly, and other people don't mind if it looks everything looks generally in focus, right? Some of you might have a pastor that moves around like crazy, and you don't have the luxury of making it so that he has this tiny depth of field because he's all over the place. And others, stay at like our pastor stays largely at the lectern. And so thus we're able to kind of get away with some things. But I mean, practically, you want to find a lens that gives you some flexibility because your environment is going to be changing. Set light changes are going to happen. Different pastors with different complexions are going to be on stage. So you need to give yourself a range to be able to, make those adjustments. I just need to get this out of my system before I forget. And the inverse is also true.
Yep.
So if you have a higher f-stop, like for example, if you're looking at buying a lens and the f-stop starts at f8, that means that it's a high f-stop. The smaller the opening in the lens is natively, the greater the depth of field, which means you have more area to focus, and the sharper the background. Now, the downside is it doesn't look as dimensional. It looks flatter. Does that make sense? Because it's a super deep focusable area.
Yeah, like our eyes focus on what's in front of us, and so that's kind of a nice aesthetic that a shallow or a small depth of field has.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the description with there's a couple YouTube videos I've run across that explain what the human eye does in relationship to lenses. A lot of this might not matter in terms of interchangeable lenses because I would assume a lot of people listening to this are just using a standard, like a camcorder of some kind. Like, you know what I mean? Like a Brevia or a Vixia or an XA or whatever. I mean, our church has switched over to largely Sony Alpha series cameras. So we have lenses now that we're dealing with. We just sold basically everything we had camera wise to buy some more Sonys because we just really like the low light usability. Incidentally, mirrorless cameras are great for that. I mean, the ISO on our Sonys, I think that it tops out, I want to say it's 64,000. So remember 800 at fifth grade party?
Yeah.
Where you had that sweet balloon thing and all that jazz? 800? Now we do 64,000. It's so bright, it's crazy, right? But anyway, circling back to the ISO thing, what I wanted to say was if you've got your aperture kind of set up the way you want it to, and it's so close, you just want to correct that brightness with ISO. So just crank that up a little bit, and for what we do, I want to say we're something like f5.6 maybe. 4.8 somewhere in there, and I think our ISOs are like 640, something like that.
Yeah. So to give you a range,
it's off the top of my head. I don't remember.
Again, like if you've never heard the word aperture or f-stop before, so okay, the news that you watch, you'll get that look with an f-stop of like what you're saying, 5.6 to 7, right?
The lighting is amazing, though.
The lighting's amazing, right?
Yeah.
And you can add that spatial element with lighting. That super cinematic YouTuber you follow, where they're doing a close up of their coffee mug, and then you
can only see one side of their face.
Only see one side of their face. That's like an f-stop of like 1.2 to like 3.5.
Word.
So that gives you a reference there.
Anywho, that essentially is cameras. We basically majored on the big three and didn't do a ton of work on some other super important things. Those super important things are white balance. Please set it up custom. Set it up to taste if you don't have meters to kind of... one way that you can do it is just get a white piece of paper, find your white piece of find what you think is the best white with that white piece of paper, and then use that as your reference point, and then adjust it from there to. But honestly, I don't even do that. I just we get our pastor up there before service, and I just adjust it to the way I think looks good, and ultimately that's what we do. If you're using conventional lights with like a quarter blue on there, you're probably going to be somewhere in the 3,000 Kelvin, like 31 to 36, I think is a reasonable range. I could be wrong, but that's just what I found kind of on all of our cameras. And then also, generally speaking, I would not set your cameras up to really auto anything, with the exception of maybe autofocus. Would you agree? I don't know how you set your cameras up.
Yeah, it depends. Like certain cameras will have better autofocusing kind of function.
Yeah.
And especially if you have a pastor that moves around, maybe try the autofocus thing.
Yeah. Now, the autofocus works if your depth of field is set so that you have the range to do that focus in, is what we've learned.
Exactly. So if you have a greater depth of field or a higher f-stop, you could probably do a manual focus where it looks good. And a good rule of thumb for focusing is like zoom in all the way on something. Anything that you can focus on, get that in focus, and then zoom out.
Indeed.
White balance, real quick. So, yeah, that is you telling your camera what white looks like. We all know that the light changes throughout the day. That's why everyone loves taking pictures at 5 or 6 o'clock at night when the sun is very warm. They call it golden hour. That looks really great. Now, the color temperature, if I held a white piece of paper up like at 6 o'clock at night when the sun's setting and 12 noon, like that's still a white sheet of paper, but our eyes compensate for that. And so your camera has a white balance feature where it tells the camera doesn't know, the camera is just a camera, where it tells the camera, this is a white sheet of paper. This is your reference point for all other colors.
Yep, that was well said. Yeah, I don't mean to fly by white balance because it's maybe the most important non-brightness feature that you have, because you don't want to smurf up there, and which is what happens if you're in like the twos, right?
And that's like, if you get your white balance right, it looks...
It's like it immediately fixes it.
It fixes a lot of things. Yeah. And like what you said, the big three, like you could even include white balance in the big four.
Sure.
Like if you get all of that, those things working together, you're well on your way to having a really good image.
Sure. And if I can just give the last tip, general life advice, especially if you're using a prosumer camera, but even still, if you're using a higher end camera that maybe you're new to, just take a day and go through the menu and maybe even write the menu stuff down and just learn what every single thing does. Because ultimately, that is what's going to give you the kind of tool belt to be able to fix. Because a lot of these things work together, some cameras will have a whole brightness thing, they'll have a contrast thing. They use different language to kind of express the same values that we're talking about here. They just express it in a different way. And if you understand that, this camera is using tint for some reason, and this other camera over here is using whatever saturation, then they generally mean the same output. That'll be super helpful to you, especially if your cameras are a little bit more on the closer to broadcast side, where you're dealing with like gamma and a bunch of other crazy things we're not going to get into now.
And I love what you said, like take a day, like block out your schedule and like take a whole day to play with this gear.
Yeah, it's one of those things that
well worth your time.
Yeah, you kind of feel like, oh, I'm wasting time messing around with it. But ultimately, there's nothing worse than being frustrated on Sunday morning. Church is supposed to start in 30 minutes and something's not working right and you don't know how to make it work. That is the worst feeling. And so, try to put yourself in a position where you're not there. Also, we don't have time to go into this today, but do some deep digging. Maybe we'll put some videos up on just color theory, generally speaking. There's a big difference between Panasonic, Canon, Sony, Blackmagic. They all process colors differently. And so you can use the lookup tables, they're called. There's LUTs for short. Basically, it's a file that will help you balance your cameras better. I think I'm saying that right. Also, some cameras use picture profiles, which can be helpful as well to build your own picture profile, especially if you have multiple cameras trying to all get them to look the same. Something to consider. All right, Jeff, we've covered cameras, which means it's time for segments.
Segment this week is This Week on CSMT. CSMT stands for Church Sound Media Tech Group. It's on Facebook. It is a jungle out there, Gabe.
70,000 users. They all are correct.
Every single one of them. So this is a segment we haven't done in a while, but I love it. And what we do for This Week in CSMT is we take a question that someone posts and look at the amount of comments that it received. and then we weigh in on that. So what is our question this week from CSMT?
Quote, church budget, I wrecked it already. Church budget is either for the PreSonus 32SC or the Allen and Heath QU16. Which should they do? Period.
How many answers has it gotten at the time of this broadcast?
163.
163 answers. Wow.
I didn't know there were that many X32s in the world.
Oh, there's more. There are X32 fields in the heartland of America where you can just harvest a bunch of them. And this is coming from an X32 user. I love the board.
Me too.
Okay, so let's weigh in on this. All right? Your budget is either for the 32SC or the Allen and Heath QU16. What should they do? Well, the first question I have by reading that is, do you want 32 channels or do you want 16 channels? In my mind, if you're going to spend the same amount of money for a console, I'd get the one with more channels.
And I was like, which is better, a QU or an SC? Because to me, I mean, on the one hand, QU. But on the other hand, like FC, right? We actually went to, remember that one time we went to Kenya and we brought a QU16 with us?
And it was great for that because it's super small. It's all like pros and cons.
And it worked awesome.
It
great. Sounded good.
It sounded great.
And it was, our sound guy was not frustrated in an environment in which he was less familiar. So he was able to kind of roll in there and like be sitting in an airport with the console on his lap because it's just sweet and cute and beautiful. And yeah, I mean, we had nothing but love for it. On the other hand, this church might have a trumpet section.
Yeah, I've heard really good things about the Studio Live 32SC. I mean, to be fair to PreSonus, they kind of like made the first prosumer digital mixing console. Granted, it was kind of clunky to get around, but like they made the first digital audio console where you could get it and not break the bank.
Yeah, and I guarantee, I had one pretty early. It's a long story how, but I mean, I think if they would have put moving faders on that thing, the difference in perception now 15 years after the fact or whatever it is, I think would be pretty different. Even though there were obvious differences in other ways, I'm just saying that I think that was a big hindrance because, the X32 came out and it's like, wait, we can buy this and it's a robot. Oh my gosh.
I was just going to ask if you felt that if the X32 didn't have motorized faders, would it have done as well as it did over the Studio Live, the first generation of Studio Live consoles?
I'm still going to say yes. I'm still going to say it would do better because it had a much better way of determining what you were doing on it. The screen was significantly better.
Yes. Yeah, I would agree with that.
You know what I mean?
Too.
So
Yep.
even though the faders on the PreSonus, and this is totally leaving the question, but I still think the X32 would do better. Ultimately, as is often the case in gigantic groups of people, everybody has super strong opinions, and not all of them are right. And we would say that the correct answer on this question is we don't know, which is usually the answer on a lot of these things because we don't know if the church has a gigantic band they need 32 channels. We don't know what the quality standard is as handed down from the pastor to the worship guy down to the lowly tech guy who ultimately had to purchase this thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, who knows?
Yeah, and I'm shooting from the hip here. Like, you have to kind of look at, so we just talked about the first PreSonus Studio Live came out, and it was revolutionary at the time. And then X32 is like, I see you, and I'll raise you this. And then they put that out, and then begins the, like, affordable quality digital mixer market.
Yeah.
Because when the X32 came out, there were pro sound companies that were selling their LS9, which was like at the time the most affordable digital console, which I think those new were like $12,000.
Yeah.
So they were selling those and getting like 3 X32s. The big question mark for the X32 at the time was, are they going to last? Like, yeah, they sound good. They're easy to operate. Do they last? I think they are like holding up pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I say that because X32 comes out, raises the game, and then PreSonus is like, nah, we're not going to lie down easily. So they go back and make this new Studio Live 32SC, which people that I respect say it's really great. So it's kind of like, it's like a boxing match. Like someone's going to land a punch and then someone's going to like retreat for a little bit, gather their stuff, and then come back with another punch, all right? But the good news for us is that it's going to raise the game across the board. And no matter what you land on, like it's going to be usable. Like you have to see, like you could get whatever you get. This is just general purchasing advice. You're going to buy something and then someone's going to come out with a better thing. And that doesn't make the thing that you have work any less than it did when you bought it. It doesn't not serve the purpose that you originally bought it for. But because this is This Week on CSMT, we take a question, we shoot from the hip, we answer it. Gabe's like, I don't know. I'm gonna go off and say I would get the PreSonus 32 SC.
I'd probably lean that way too, having never used it. It just seems to me like there's more channels, man. Can the sound output possibly be so bad? Can it possibly be so hard to use that you're willing to sacrifice 16 channels? And I would assume, again, not looking up this console at all, doing basically no homework on this because I'm a slacker, I would assume that there's also more auxes and probably more matrices and probably more packaging materials. I mean, who doesn't love peanuts?
Well, we've answered it, Gabe.
We did it. I have no rant for today. I'm sorry. I usually have a good soapbox to get on, but I don't know if it's because spring break's coming up and I'm mellowing out or whatever, or maybe it's just I'm too worried about Easter that I don't have time to rant. But
it's okay. This has been a great episode. We hope it's been informative. Remember, we have email addresses now. We're moving on up in the podcast world. You can email me at worship@worshipguytechguy.com.
Or you can email me at why did it take so long to get this email working at worshipguytechguy.com.
Wait, so why did it...
I haven't made that one yet, but
is that all lowercase?
I got to quit doing that because now I'm going to have to actually make that because one of our snarky friends will... they're going to email and they're going to give us a hard time. Hey, thank you all so much for listening and learning with us as we go down this journey together. Jeffrey Yoel.
Gabe Johannes.
We'll see you guys next week.